What's up guys, welcome back to another GGF video, and today I'll be taking a look at an interesting case from EK and Inwin. Now this is a modern take on the original 909 from Inwin, and this is the 909 EK. So it's basically a redesigned 909 from the ground up with some interesting water cooling features from EK. So we'll check out all that, and also in this video I'll be adding my magnitude CPU block testing, which in my part 1 video a few months ago I was going to get around to doing, and I've added it into this video, so stay tuned for that at the end. And I've also done a time-lapse build on this full system, so if you haven't seen that yet, be sure to check out that. Now let's jump in and take a look. But before that, this video is brought to you by ASRock and their new Z490 Taichi motherboard with turbocharged VRM cooling, 14-phase driver MOSFET design with 60 amp power choke for 10th gen and future generation Intel Core processor support. With Nahimic audio and front panel ESS DAC, allows you to take full control of your audio experience. A fresh new look that will complement any build, and with direct RGB control straight from the BIOS, eliminates any use of RGB software. Learn more in the link below. When it comes to high-end PC cases, Inwin is a brand that really stands out, and when it comes to water cooling, I'm sure you've all heard of EK. So what happens when these two brands mix? We get the 909 EK. You may be thinking you've seen this chassis before. Yes, it does look similar to the Inwin 909 released a few years back, but this new collab between EK and Inwin is a complete new case from the ground up. This means updated features, new tooling, and oh yeah, a freaking distro plate which the motherboard mounts to. First off, let's address the elephant in the room, and that is price. The 909 EK has been teased for a very long time, and we all knew it wasn't going to be cheap. You're looking at roughly 2200 Australian or roughly 1500 US for this workmanship. A total of 200 of these cases exist, each with their individual plaque, and I'll show you where this can be mounted later on. I've worked with expensive cases in the past and worked with many Inwin cases as well. Most of the time with expensive chassis, looks come first and functionality comes second. As I said earlier, the 909 EK isn't just an original 909 with a distro plate slapped to it. The case has been redesigned from the ground up, and what a design change it's had. Yes, from afar you get those 909 vibes, but internally it's just so much more functional. If you've ever had or worked on the 909, you probably remember airflow was an issue, the interior was cramped, water cooling was a mission, and all the rear I/O cables pass through a small little hole. The 909 EK removes that extra chamber at the rear and focuses more at the front of the chassis. Remarkably, the 909 EK's height and width are both the same as the original 909, with only the width expanding 25mm to 255mm. We still find that beautiful 4mm brushed aluminum that wraps around the entire chassis, but now with an included L-shaped piece that runs inside. This is where you'll find the case's I/O, which is kept simple and clean with a power button, activity LEDs, 2 USB Type-A, audio ports and USB Type-C. You might be wondering, isn't that where the side panel would go? But interestingly enough, both sides of the 909 EK are completely open, so keep this in mind if you live in a dusty environment. Another area that has been greatly improved, and no doubt you can thank EK for this, is in terms of water cooling. I won't touch base on this just yet. Taking a closer look inside the chassis, motherboard spec is up to EATX 277mm wide. Boards like the EVGA X299 Dark or Gigabyte X570 Extreme had no issues fitting at all. When it comes to cable routing, you probably haven't seen a setup like this before. EK have plenty of cutouts around the distro plate for where you'd normally need your cables to go, but instead of just leaving it like this, EK have provided a very, and I mean very decent amount of cable combs. These are made from brass, and I've been told they contribute heavily to the overall cost of the case. They don't just clip onto your cables because hey, that would be boring, but these actually screw to the dedicated locations on the motherboard tray while holding your cables. There's also 6 more cutouts just under the distro plate which feed all the cables down to your power supply. The reason EK have supplied so many are for all the different configurations one may have, like single or dual 8-pin EPS, dual 8-pin or single 8-pin for GPU and so on. EK also provides 6 blanking plates, 1 general purpose plate with just a square hole, and lastly a blanking plate with your run number, and for me, mine is number 2 of 200. The only concern I found was with unconventional motherboards like the Z390 Dark, where EPS are over near the 24 pin. Storage support can be found in the PSU chamber behind the power supply. There's two trays with each supporting a 2.5 inch SSD or a 3.5 inch hard drive. Accessing the bottom chamber is very easy and is done by unscrewing the 6 countersunk screws. This is the same for each side, and I'm really glad access can be gained from both sides, as once the radiator chamber is populated, this is the only area to cable up your system. The front of the chassis is a dedicated water cooling chamber that can hold up to two EKXE480 radiators. Yes, that's two 60mm thick 480 radiators. This is the largest config you can have while keeping the middle 3-fan bracket. It is possible to go with thicker radiators for each side, but the middle fan bracket will need to be removed. In saying that, if you do pick this chassis up, I highly recommend heading down the path of going EK for your water cooling gear. I'm not just saying this for extra bounty points with EK, but it's quite simple. The case was co-designed with EK, so everything has been designed for EK spec. For example, the radiator fitment has been designed around EK radiators, and in some areas it came down to just millimeters for clearance. Two dedicated pump mounts are located in the basement, which fit EK standard X-Top Revo D5s, and the distro plate G-quarter locations for fittings are all lined up for EK water blocks. Taking a closer look at the distro plate, we find it's mounted to each end of the motherboard area with a total of 8 screws. I do like how it doesn't completely fill this area, so for some last resort cable routing can always be run in these gaps. The in and the out terminals for the distro plate are hidden in the radiator chamber. The bottom port feeds to your pump, while the top port is the return from your radiator. I really love how EK have done this by using solid brass terminals. In terms of routing your tubes, 2 rows of G-quarter threads are supplied for your GPU. This is to cover motherboards with the first PCI slot being right up the top or second from the top. Then the only other run you'll see is from your CPU block. A nice touch, which you may not have noticed yet, is the RGB panel at the top of the chassis. This is 3-pin ARGB with the hidden cable running down to the PSU area. So I think we'll check out the final build first, and then we'll take a look at the CPU block testing between the magnitude and the velocity. And before I go over the EK block testing, I just want to go and cover some extra features on this case that I didn't go through before. Now, the main issue you're going to have is the specific box you go for, especially for your CPU setup. Now, I highly recommend going with either the EK magnitude or the EK velocity CPU box. I tried either one and mine was still both slightly off, but the magnitude I went down with here did line up pretty good. It was just a fraction off. Now with my setup, you can see I've gone with two 45s together, and then I've sort of skewed them to get the two straight runs. Now without them just coming out with straight 90s and going straight down, it was a little bit off and it kind of looked a little bit weird. But I've done a bit of a diagram for anyone who has this case or looking to pick up this case and they do want their perfect runs. For the in, which is the backmost port for your CPU, which is out of the distro plate into the CPU block, you're looking at 42 millimeters for the center of your CPU block to the middle standoff. Now for the out, which is the port closest to me, which goes out of the CPU block back into the distro plate, you're looking at about 13 millimeters from the center of that out port to that middle standoff. So if you've got a setup at home, you can pretty much measure that now. If you've got a block on your board, you can measure from each of those ports to that middle standoff. And if you're within those two measurements, you'll pretty much have a direct line for those two runs. For GPU block, I had no issues at all. These are standard EK blocks. I've gone with torque fittings. I didn't have to do anything tricky. They just curved straight around, which worked perfectly. Another area I want to cover is mainly around this whole radiator chamber. Now the radiator fan direction is completely up to you. My setup, I've blocked off the front. I'm going in the main side and then straight out the rear. So I have no air moving around inside here. It's up to you whether you want to keep the included radiator fan bracket. You can go in from the middle and then you can go out from both sides. It's completely up to you. I wanted to add this acrylic panel, which is made out of opal. It's good for light distribution. I wanted to add something a little bit different and block this off, and then I put some LEDs in the front and then that lights up really nice. Now in terms of the price of this case, and I'm just wondering what your thoughts would be on something like a distro plate version, distro plate less version, so one that doesn't have the distro plate, maybe one that doesn't have all the brass cable combs, because they were quite expensive, and then you could have a cheaper case. Probably for the cable comb cutouts, you could just have some nice rectangular holes, and I think that would make a cheaper version, because at 1500 US or 2000 Australian, it's quite a lot for a case like this, because I really think the functionality for this chassis is much better than the original 909. We've got the support for the two 480s. If we didn't have a distro plate, you could put a reservoir in here. You could probably fit a reservoir at the front here and so on. Just something I thought of instead of going with this setup here. Now in terms of my build, I didn't want to do any crazy modding. Well, I didn't do any modding at all. A lot of my case reviews and case builds, I do slight modding, paint work, customization and so on with panels, but I wanted to see how this case would look leaving completely stock. Now I already knew it was probably going to look good because the case itself is beautiful and it's beautiful to work in. But in saying that, I just wanted to see how everything went and sort of fitted by default, because you are paying a lot of money for this chassis. In terms of the radiators in the chamber here, I did go with the thickest radiators there were from EK. The XE versions, they are 60 millimeters thick. Once you put the fans on, 25 millimeters each, so that brings out about 85 millimeters on each side, and it was getting tight. Now if you do go with other brands of radiators, I believe EKs are quite wide, so you should have a little bit less width if you go with different brands. Now in saying that, the holes all for the radiator screw down points are countersunk. They're about an M3, M4 countersunk head size. So just bear in mind, if you do go with non-countersunk screws, I managed to have a lot of short UNC 632 countersunk head screws, so I could use all those for the EK radiators. I do know other radiators are M4. They're much larger button heads, so when you do screw those in, just be careful you're not scratching around on the outside of that material. And in saying that, I did find these outside panels quite durable. I was afraid they were going to scratch. They are powder coated on a sort of a matte black. Fingerprints are pretty good, just as long as your hands aren't super greasy, and they do show up like fingernail marks, but they just do rub off, which is really nice. Now probably the last area I want to cover is routing all your cables. The main issue I found were sort of accessory cables, like the front panel I/O cable, RGB block cables and so on. I kind of feel they needed just an extra little hidden hole behind the motherboard tray somewhere. Then you could route really fine wires in between the motherboard standoffs and in between the motherboard, and then you could just loop them on to where you need them to go on the motherboard. And lastly, as I said earlier, inside was very, very tight. I recommend going with the smallest fittings you can find. So things like EK Classic fittings would probably be the way to go. Definitely something not like the EK Torque fittings, because they are much, much thicker and much more bulkier. You are restricted on room, so you want to go with the smallest gear you have for that in terms of fittings. Now, jumping over to the block testing, I did the part 1 of the magnitude block a few months ago, and I said I was going to follow up with a part 2 video. So this is kind of that video now towards the end. I was testing the magnitude block with the velocity, and now I've thrown in a third test, which is throwing this build into the benchmarking as well. Now bear in mind that the test setup here is slightly different than the other 2 block setups. The magnitude and the velocity were both on my test bench. They were running a single Hardware Labs GTX 480, running the single D5, the 4 EK-X3M fans, and that was on the CPU loop only. Now that was on an i9-10900X at 47 GHz at a 1.34 V core, and that was on the ASRock X299 Type Chi. Now moving over to this setup, of course this is going to vary, but I wanted to see what it would be like throwing 2 extra GPUs in the mix with the extra radiator. So basically we had the magnitude and velocity on the test bench, and then we had the third setup, which is this system here. Now I've only got 3 graphs. I tested Prime 95, I tested Cinebench, that was a bit of a curveball I wanted to throw in, and then I tested the Ada 64 CPU stress test. Now it may not seem like a lot of graphs, but this took quite a few days of testing because I needed to get consistency. I couldn't just run one test and just leave it like that. And I had a pretty strict instruction set that I ran in terms of testing these blocks. I had a 2-minute warm up, I had a 10-minute run, and then I had a 10-minute cool down. And I did that quite a few times. Now I had a warm up because I just didn't want to start testing and then start grabbing the temp straight away. So I wanted everything to just get nice and warm, and then I can go from there. And in terms of getting the values, instead of just going with the max core, I kind of thought that would skew the results a bit, because sometimes you can get a random core just fluctuate and then go back down. So what I do is I've got all the averages over that time period of 10 minutes, and then I've got the single average overall of those, and that's given me my single figure. So let's jump in and have a look at the results. The magnitude, now these are both the nickel and plexi blocks. The magnitude on Prime 95 smallest FFTs AVX off for 10 minutes was 61.1 degrees. Now this is delta T, so this is minus the room temp, so 61.1 degrees. And then the velocity on the test bench was 63.2 degrees. So that's pretty much bang on 2 degrees difference. So that's pretty much what I was expecting, and I think that's what we've seen the marketing material go around for these boxes. You're going to get a few degrees difference. Whether or not that's vital to you, that's completely up to you. If you're thinking you could do with some slightly cooler temps, then yep, the magnitude could be the block for you. Now throwing the 909 EK in the mix, we saw the temperature of 62.6 degrees. So I was quite surprised that that actually slotted in the middle. So I guess that having the 2 extra GPUs and that 480 radiator sort of offset each other, and the temps are pretty much the same. Now moving on to the Cinebench R20. Now this was a little bit interesting because I just looped Cinebench R20 for 10 minutes. Now it does have an area where it cools down for about 1 second. Once the test finishes and before it starts again for the second test, there's about a 1 second cooldown where all the cores sort of drop back down and then the starter back up. So I wanted to see how throwing that in the mix would go. For the magnitude, we saw a 55.9 degree. For the runs, we saw the velocity at 56.6. So this is getting close to about just around 1 degree difference. And then for the 909 EK, we saw 56.3. So pretty much bang on in the middle again. Now mind you, these GPUs in the system were running at about 29 degrees the whole time. So I guess that 480 radiator was sort of offsetting those temperatures. And the last test was the Ada 64 CPU stress test, and I ran that for 10 minutes. And saying a stress test, I really don't think AIDA64 CPU stress really does that much, especially compared to Prime 95. Personally, I think Prime 95 for most systems is too much, and I think the AIDA64 is not enough, because Prime 95 was drawing roughly 300 watts, whereas the AIDA64 CPU stress wasn't even pulling 200 watts. So I wanted to see what throwing something in a little bit less than load was going to do. They weren't idle, it wasn't max load, it was kind of in the middle. For the magnitude, we saw 39.8 degrees, the velocity we saw 41.3, and then the biggest difference out of all of our tests was the 999 EK in the mix was 45.2 degrees. Now I can only assume because we had less load on the system, idle temps were slightly a little bit higher, and that's why I think on the 999, probably idle was a little bit higher because we did have the 2 GPUs in the loop as well. So that's pretty much it for my block testing there. As you can see, a few degrees difference for the magnitude. If you're doing extreme cooling, it could be a block for you. For most users, I find the velocity is still a very, very good block, and it will definitely be a decent block for most people. I think we're getting to the stage where water cooling is that high end. We're really having issues getting cooler and cooler. Like I can't see another brand releasing a block, say a year's time, that's going to drop 5 degrees, and another block dropping 5 degrees. We're at that limit now, especially with ambience. I guess if ambience are getting much, much cooler, then we may see differences between the blocks. But yeah, that's pretty much it on this video. Let me know what you think of this build, and especially thinking of a alternative version for the case, even maybe something like different colors or maybe cheaper versions so more people can get their hands on this chassis, because I really do like the functionality and I really do like the rad space this case offers, because there's nothing around with a case this size that offers this much cooling potential. But anyway, that's it for this video. I want to thank EK for sending this gear to check out. I want to thank you guys for watching, and stay tuned for the next one.